Sharma.
My lady, the next witness is Simon Manley.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Mr. Manley, good afternoon. You've provided two witness statements, or forgive me, one witness statement to the inquiry in your own name, and you've also adopted the witness statement of Sir Philip Barton, which you're able to speak to during the course of your evidence. Would you confirm that those statements are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are indeed.
Thank you. Mr. Manley, to start, please, with your biography, a little bit about yourself. You are formerly the Director General of COVID-19 at the FCO, a position which you held between March and September of 2020.
Correct.
And prior to that, you were the British Ambassador to Spain,
That's right.
and you were also a non-resident ambassador to Andorra between October 2013 and August of 2019.
That's exactly right, yes.
And you've been in the diplomatic service since 1990. You're currently the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, in addition to other international organizations based in Geneva. Is that correct?
That is indeed correct, yes.
Mr. Manley, can I start, please, with the FCO's role prior to the pandemic in respect of procurement? Before the pandemic hit in China and in the UK, did the FCO have any prior role in pandemic procurement or any anticipated role in pandemic procurement?
In pandemic procurement, not really, no. I mean, obviously, we'd had some preparations for a series of eventualities around pandemics, but not really for taking on a role in procurement.
When the pandemic struck in China and in the UK, was there any guidance or playbook which the FCO officials could rely upon to respond to the emergency?
So, if I may say, I mean, our initial involvement was very much a consular involvement, and it was in the initial outbreak in Wuhan and then in subsequent outbreaks in hotels in Tenerife and elsewhere. So the involvement in procurement only really came in and around the first time I think we actually get actively involved in this is around the 14th of March 2020.
So the focus of the FCO prior to that date was about repatriating citizens to the United Kingdom?
We'd established the task force, a joint task force with DFID in February, I think to look at the broader international implications of the emerging, was still not yet a declared pandemic. So it was an anticipation of something that might be coming our way. And then there was this consular response, as I say, in Wuhan, a couple of cruise ships in Tenerife and elsewhere, where you'd had outbreaks and where we'd had to repatriate British nationals and in some cases our own staff.
And from your perspective as a Director General, when did it come to your attention that this pandemic might affect global supply chains, and in particular supply chains emanating in China?
So I became Director General on the 16th of March 2020, so it's just after the initial requests out of Number 10 for help to secure ventilators. And so pretty much my first day in the job was dominated by this challenge. But it throughout this early period, it is one of a series of challenges, and the challenges of returning British nationals to the UK continues to be a big focus for our organisation in those first few weeks and months.
So to focus, please, on that initial request. Did that initial request emanate from Number 10 in the 14th of March 2020? Number 10 sought the assistance of the FCO to try and procure ventilators directly from China. That's correct, yes. So I think we had been led to believe by a professor at Oxford that there was a willingness on the part of a colleague of his in China to help us secure those ventilators. Yeah. And in relation to that request, what assistance did the Department for Health and Social Care provide to the FCO?
So, I mean, on the specific request in respect of China, that specific request didn't go that far. I mean, I think what becomes quite clear pretty immediately is that we have a bigger problem on our hands, and that there is a requirement to secure several thousand ventilators within the space of a month or so. And so where we go to DHSC essentially to understand precisely what it is we're looking for. None of us are experts in ventilators, and so it is to acquire the sort of spec that our post should be looking out for, and you'll see from the material that.
Forgive me, was that a request that was made by the FCO of the Department of Health and Social Care, or did they offer their assistance to you?
I can't really remember what was the sequence, but we wrote out to, originally to our post in China, but then subsequently to a number of other posts in the network for help in trying to identify potential suppliers of ventilators. And obviously what our post required was a sense of what was the specification of the ventilators that we were looking to acquire.
In terms of the expertise available in country, focusing please on China.
Yes, sure.
What sort of expertise was available to the FCO and therefore to the UK government by virtue of the FCO's officials in country?
So what we had in China at the time, and I suppose it's just worth kind of, if I may, just giving a bit of context. I mean, the pandemic had obviously, China had been the first place the pandemic hit, and therefore, in response to the pandemic, we'd already had to...
Please slow down, please.
Sorry, we had already had to close 2 of our consulates in China. We were left with 2 other consulates outside of Beijing plus the embassy. So we still had Chongqing and Shanghai, plus the embassy in Beijing. What we had across that network was a cross-government operation. So we had staff working for various bits of the British government, and in particular what we had were 2 bits of expertise. And that was the staff who we had working on trade and investment matters, drawn primarily from DIT, as then was, who had a knowledge, particularly those of whom had been working on the life science sector. They had an awareness of the Chinese market, of the sort of companies who might be out there. And then, more broadly, of course, what we had were people who knew China pretty well, who had the language expertise, who had an understanding of the relationship between firms and the state, which enabled us to navigate the terrain. And I think it's important to remember that we had what we had, because at that stage you couldn't send additional people into China because of the pandemic restrictions. And indeed, we'd had to remove quite a number of our staff and a lot of dependents over the course of the previous 2 months. So many of the people who would normally be working in China were still working on Chinese matters, but working from secondary locations.
So just to break that down a little bit. So in China, 2 types of experts, if I may
Correct.
call them that. Some who are experts in the country.
Correct.
And others who have built up some expertise in relation to trade and investment and commercial matters.
Yes, and obviously, I mean, there's an overlap. So many of those who had been working on life science issues within our trade and investment team obviously also had a knowledge of China itself, language expertise or whatever.
Of course. You refer there to border closures that had
Yes.
taken place. What effect did that have on the people who were in country and them able to be supplemented by others flying from the UK? Was that simply an impossibility?
It was effectively an impossibility. So we had to work with in terms of the people on the ground, and as I said, they were supplemented throughout by those who would have normally been posted to China, but who we'd drawn down, as we'd say, in the weeks previous. But we couldn't send in additional people for some time. And also you have to remember, as in many parts of the world, including, of course, in the UK, these are people who are obviously often having to work from home because they were under lockdown. So the the pure logistics of working were quite hard.
You, of course, were based in the United Kingdom, were you not?
Yeah, I was indeed, yes.
And in relation to the contact between the team based in China and the United Kingdom, did that come through the FCO in London, or was that directly with the Department for Health and Social Care?
So I think there were different types of contact. So I was in frequent contact with our ambassador there to get her sight of the overall state of affairs. We had unusually direct contact between the network of the China network, who were busily trying to help DHSC procure goods, and DHSC. And we also had our team, became initially known as ACT, then GACT, and then GCEP, who were this interface, if you like, between our global network and our team in London.
Thank you, Mr. Manley. We've heard about ACT, JACT, and so on just earlier this afternoon. Could I move on, please, from ventilators, which was the initial procurement request, to the matter of PPE and China buy? Could you talk us through, please, the evolution of the team moving from procurement and seeking out ventilators to seeking out PPE?
So, as you say, Sharma, the initial challenge was ventilators, but actually quite quickly. I mean, this at the time this seemed like a period of months, but of course this was days and at most weeks. It became clear that the NHS was going to require vast quantities of protective equipment. And indeed, as we had been out in the Chinese marketplace, we had been conscious of the opportunities that already existed for PPE. And indeed, about a sort of week or so after I've come into the job, we were already asking the network as a whole to get a sense of what the sourcing opportunities are likely to be for PPE.
When you're talking about the network as a whole, how many people, just roughly, are you talking in country, in China, doing this sort of work for the FCO?
So in the case of China, which is probably the best documented, if I could put it like that, I mean, at peak, we have about anywhere between 170 and 200 people working on these issues in China on a shift basis.
And of those people, what is the divide between those who, as you described earlier, are in-country experts or country experts, and then those with commercial expertise?
I don't know the precise distinction between the two.
The work that was being conducted by the FCO officials in country in China, could you help us, please, with how they went about sourcing PPE? Who were they approaching? Who were they seeking out contacts for?
So, I mean, in the initial phase, that they are trying to understand what the landscape looks like. Who are the companies out there who might be able to provide at this sort of scale? It is, as you've heard elsewhere, including from the press of this morning, it's a very cutthroat market by this stage. There are obviously a number of other governments and organisations trying to secure PPE. So they're trying to identify what the possibilities are and then reporting back on those possibilities
Who are they
to DHSC.
I'm sorry, who are they reporting back to?
To DHSC, essentially.
And in terms of the reporting back to DHSC, presumably there's this ongoing dialogue between the officials on the ground in China and DHSC. Are DHSC providing the specifications and the type of kit that they require? And is the China team responding to that?
Yes, that's essentially the process. So, I mean, DHSC had that expertise, and of course they had the best understanding of the changing requirements for PPE as we understood better the likely path of the pandemic in the UK.
And what sort of work, those officials based, again, focusing in on China,
Yes.
What sort of work were they doing with respect to specifications and letters of intent and contracts, focusing in, please, on the very earliest stages of the pandemic?
So in the very earliest stages, they're where they can, they're trying to visit the production centres, the factories, if that's possible. They're trying to get clarity on the precise spec of the goods being produced in China, and then checking that with the HSC as to whether this is indeed what we require. So it's an iterative process, and one of which we're obviously trying to move at pace because of both the clear scale of the requirement from the UK, but also the intense nature of the competition on the ground.
And you refer to visiting factories or manufacturers or suppliers. Of course, there were some restrictions on movement. And so what effect did that have on the way in which the team in country in China could view and certify and check whether the manufacturers were going to be able to provide the kind of equipment which was needed in the UK?
So when they couldn't visit in person, they were trying to find other ways of getting that certainty, whether it was through kind of video footage or other means. They were very conscious that we needed to be absolutely sure of the goods that were coming to us, and that the facilities or the firms with which we were dealing were ones that were going to be able to produce these goods of the right quality in the right time frame at the right price.
In terms of the split between the leadership of those teams, obviously there's the Department of Health and Social Care based in the United Kingdom, and then the FCO, who is effectively working on the front line. What was the split in terms of leadership? Were the FCO able to take a lead in terms of sourcing and then signing contracts, or did it always have to wait for DHSC to make a decision?
So, I would like to say that the China operation was very much a joined-up cross-government operation. So we're the team, this 170 to 200 odd people at peak, are drawn from across the embassy and the two remaining consulates. So they're people from across government. Has a large DIT component. It's headed at the end. The head of missions, obviously, Foreign Office, but it's very much a cross-government team. Sorry, I've forgotten the beautiful question. Apologies.
Who was taking the lead in relation to signing contracts and making sure that equipment was being procured? Was it still the Department of Health and Social Care, or was that something which the FCO was doing for itself?
So there are a number of contracts in the very early phase which are signed by that China team on the ground. But quite quickly, we try to get ourselves into a position where those contracts are being formally signed off by DHSC. But it's always kind of part of a conversation between the team on the ground and DHSC as to whether we're providing the right material.
So it was possible, as it was at the very early stage of the pandemic, for those who are based in country at the FCO in China to source and secure and sign contracts for items such as PPE.
That was the case with a proportion in the early phase, yes.
We don't need to turn it up, but on the 18th of April of 2020, the First Secretary of State, Dominic Raab, made a proposal, which was that the FCO ought to be able to continue to purchase PPE directly in country, not requiring the contracts to come back to the Department of Health and Social Care. Can you help us, please, with the reasons as to why that wasn't taken forward?
Because I think, look, we looked at it very carefully. I think these all the way through, we're questioning ourselves as to whether we've got the right methodologies in place. That explains this occasionally slightly bewildering sort of acronym soup as we move from ACT to JACT to GCEP and whatever, because we're constantly saying to ourselves, is this the best way of doing things? And so when the Secretary of State asked us to have a look at this, we had another look at this. We came to the conclusion that, at least at that stage, that wasn't going to materially change our performance, because this is now several weeks into this process, and what's important is throughout is the precision of the demand signal, which I think Andrew Mitchell referred to this morning, and the pace of the decisions. Not because pace in of itself is important, but it's important in this particular context where one of the risks that we faced was of us finding the right material at the right place and at the right price, but finding that we had been outbid by somebody before we could sign off that contract. So pace was important in that particular respect. And I think we concluded that having the contracts being signed off by the local head of mission wasn't at that stage going to make a material difference to that.
Could we turn up, please, 493785? These are emails between the Department of International Trade employees about China procurement in some of the very earliest stages of the pandemic, between the 23rd of March and the 26th of March. Could we go down, please, to an email on the 23rd of March from Mr. Duke? It begins, the single most important ask.
Mm-hmm.
2/3 of the way down, please.
Yeah.
3 paragraphs from the bottom. The single most important ask from our team in China is this: London should approve procurement immediately of everything the NHS will need in the coming weeks and months. Delay will mean we may not be able to secure stock. We understand the need to prioritise, but we must stop, and my emphasis, our current sequential approach. Could you help us, please, with what you've described, which is, if I may say so, a sequential approach, some work being done in country, followed by some work being done by the Department of Health and Social Care, to what was required at the very earliest stages of the pandemic?
So I'm not sure I necessarily, if I may say, describe that as an entirely sequential approach, because I think there's a constant process of engagement and interaction between the China network and DHSC. I mean, as I said, I can understand the frustration of those, if you like, on the front line in China who are out there trying to find this PPE, and often doing so, and wanted a quick answer because they feared, as I said, that, as in this case, that we would turn up 2 days later to discover that somebody else had come in the interim and had purchased those goods instead of us.
I'm sorry, Mr. Manley, could I ask you just please to slow down a touch?
So people were frustrated, I think, that they would, in some occasions, find items, would report that back, and by the time that we'd got an answer as to whether this indeed was a contract with which we wished to proceed, that somebody else had come in and purchased it. On the other hand, I also understand quite how difficult it was to have a clear projection several months out of what our needs might be over the course of the year. So there was an understandable tension there. But throughout, we are trying to speed up the process. But at the same time, we have to have due respect for ensuring that we've got the right items at the right price and that we can be confident about the supplier. So it's a constant tension throughout this process.
Could we please bring up that email again, 493785, just to see what the consequences can be in the event that speed is not prioritised? If we go to the second paragraph from the bottom, this is a practical example of what happens if speed is not prioritised, again, in the very earliest stages of the pandemic. To give just one example, last Thursday, we informed the Department of Health and Social Care we were ready to procure tens of millions of COVID-19 test kits. Today, we still haven't received the green light to place orders, and over the weekend, the United States bought all of the stock of COVID-19 testing kits in China. And if we can go down, please, to the following paragraph. This observation: we've been consistently behind the curve, but we need to get ahead of it. The China network is ready to respond. We have dozens of people working on healthcare procurement with more on standby. The Department for International Trade is leading this work, and the expertise and industry connections of the DIT teams in China is saving lives in the UK, and we can do more. Please feel confident to strongly make the case in any meetings where the opportunity lies. And so, Mr. Manley, what I'm suggesting to you is that if the FCO at the time were enabled to enter into and procure more kit on the ground, that these sorts of events might not have happened.
I still think I think it was important for us to ensure that we were procuring the goods in a way that was consistent with the NHS's needs as they were being relayed to us by DHSC. And whoever was doing that procurement on the ground had to have that assurance at the end of the day. But I recognise it was as I said, it was an extraordinarily competitive environment, and frustrating therefore to the teams when contracts that they thought might be available kind of were lost to us.
Could we bring up, please, INQ 0004 77701 to touch a little, please, on the China buy process? This is a letter from Tom Duke, who is the Senior Responsible Officer of the COVID-19 Procurement Task Force, about procurement of PPE in China towards a medium and long-term strategy. This is going forward a little bit in the chronology to the 23rd of April of 2020. Could we display, please, down to bullet point page 1, paragraph 4. This again is an indication of the coordination that was required between the FCO, the Department for International Trade, and the Department for Health and Social Care. And if we can go down, please, to page 6. I won't take you through every single element of this because we've considered it in a little detail with Mr. Marin. But the process through which offers had to be coordinated between the FCO in country in China and the Department of Health and Social Care in the United Kingdom, combined with such things as time differences, communication issues and the such like, would that not have slowed the process for procurement of PPE at the early stage of the pandemic and even into these later stages in April?
Look, I mean, we were trying to run this process as quickly as we could, along with colleagues in DHSC. I think what, in some ways, if I may say, what this annex also shows you is us trying to be very clear with our teams who are working on this of the steps they had to go through, which are important steps, after all, important steps about due diligence and the rest. Like I say, it was a constant tension. I recognise that.
Could we go back, please, to page 1 of that document? I'd like to ask you some questions, please, about the China buy sourcing strategy.
Yes.
If we could turn to page 2. Thank you, and paragraph 5 at the top. This sets out, again, this is in April of 2020, that the primary sourcing strategy for PPE in China was to work with large state-owned healthcare distributors, and explains the reason why that is. Would you be able to explain to the inquiry, please, given that the China buy team was so close in proximity to large state-owned manufacturers, as to why you understand it was considered that a new buy team also had to be set up to deal with offers that may have very well been coming from the same source?
Yes, I've less sight, I have to admit, of that bit of it. I mean, what I think you see here is perhaps coming back, if I may say, Mr. Sharma, to where we started as to what is it that the people who we did have deployed in China brought to this operation. And I think what you see in this strategy, which prioritises state-owned enterprises, is that combination of sort of, if you like, political insight into the way that state and business operate in China, and a knowledge of the sector itself. And that led them to this conclusion about how we should focus our effort on the state-owned enterprises as a means of, if you like, reducing our vulnerabilities to securing contracts with companies who would prove less able to deliver the goods procured in the time and the quality.
Did you or anyone else within the FCO raise the fact that the China buy team was very close to a number of large manufacturers in country, and that perhaps one of the strategies which ought to have been deployed would have been to focus attention on those factories rather than, as we've heard from other witnesses, intermediaries who sit between those factories and the PPE supply in the United Kingdom?
Yes, well, Andrew Mitchell was explaining this morning. I think we were aware that intermediaries were not necessarily a particularly helpful avenue down which to go, because in many cases it turned out that you were dealing with somebody who was in turn dealing with the very company that we were already dealing with. So that kind of those.
And sorry, just to break that down.
Sorry.
So what you're saying is that it's quite possible that there would be a contract with one of those large manufacturers in China, with which the United Kingdom government has a contract to supply PPE, and then in addition to that, the government may be contracting with intermediaries whose ultimate supplier is the same manufacturer.
That would indeed be a possibility, and it's also something, to be honest, that happened to us outside of the UK. So I think, if I remember rightly, I think it was the case in Malta, where again we identified a company who showed that they were kind of be willing to sell their PPE to us, and then when we kind of looked further, we realised actually their goods were being produced in China. So there was a risk that we were going to go all the way round again to end up with similar goods, but would have been better off going to the original supplier. But at the same time, we were very. We wanted to ensure that we weren't neglecting a potential opportunity as well. So it's, again, there's a tension there.
Could we have a look, please, at INQ 000494034, a document about this potential issue of gazumping, one contractor gazumping another contract in China. And if we turn to page 2, perhaps over the page to 3. Forgive me, there it is at the second from the bottom bullet point. It is invaluable to have joint coordination function, reference to the JACT, and then this may also have helped to mitigate self-gazumping in the context of procurement not recommended or even known about by the China network. So there was that risk. This document is setting out the potential risks of being gazumped, of the UK DHSC team being gazumped or vice versa by the China buy team based in China. Could you help us, please, with what steps were put in place to stop or limit the risk of that having happened?
So, I'm not sure about the particular context of the assertion here, but it is certainly true to say that we were concerned at various points in this early period by the fact that we, so our sort of China network purchasing team, were not the only UK entity seeking to purchase PPE in China. So that there were cases of other UK entities, whether they be devolved administrations or NHS trusts or others, who were seeking to procure, and with a risk that you indeed did end up sort of, if you like, gazumping yourself, or at least competing against other UK entities. And I think you'll know that I think it's around the 16th of April or so when the Permanent Secretary at DHSC writes, for example, to the devolved administrations to stress the point that we're going to be trying to insist upon a kind of all UK procurement policy.
Forgive me, Mr. Manley, it's my fault. This document I should have introduced to you.
Sorry.
What it is, it's a paper produced by the Department for International Trade. It's produced in the 1st of June of 2020, and it's headed that there are lessons learned for the London procurement team.
Yeah.
And that of one of the risks which is identified is that risk of self-gazumping and of intermediaries. And so the question I had for you was as to whether, to the best of your knowledge, there was a system or a process in place, either in China or in the UK or within DHSC, to make sure that the United Kingdom wasn't effectively competing with itself.
So we recognised that there was a bit of a problem. And actually, I think DHSC, certainly in respect of the devolved administrations, took action to try and ensure that we were not competing against ourselves. But it had been a problem in the early stages. I think we'd be the first to admit that. And that, if I may say, was, one of the, I think Andrew Mitchell this morning kind of focused on the role of the JCT as a sort of transmission point, if you like, between the demand signal and the supply signal, if I put it in those terms. But there was also a point about the JCT and indeed GSEP later on, being a sort of single point of information for all of us within the system, including our ministers, as to where we were in the procurement process. And I think that was one of the things we were trying to sort through.
Could I turn, please, to some of the lessons that were learned by the FCO as a result of the China bioprocurement process? So setting aside what the Department for International Trade had considered the lessons that were learned, what reflections did the FCO have about the operation of the China buy team and the procurement of PPE?
So I think, two things. I think we thought they did a tremendous job. First of all, they did a tremendous job in the most difficult of circumstances, as so many other people did in response to the pandemic. This cutthroat competition, the pace at which they were having to work, the pressure which they felt on, as we all did, to secure first ventilators and then PPE at pace for our colleagues back on the front line in the NHS.
In the witness statement of Sir Philip Barton,
Yeah.
he describes that a number of the issues arise from staff training and a lack of expertise on the front line in China. Is that a sentiment that you agree with?
Yes, and I do. So I agree. So we drew a number of lessons from it, which we've put into practice, or trying to put into practice, which include the training that's available to people, the procurement policies that we have in place. But I would just want to register that I think, in terms of the commitment that those officers showed, the skill and dexterity they demonstrated in very difficult conditions, they did a tremendous job. We were constantly learning, constantly trying to adapt our processes and procedures. And I think you see that working through the 3 or 4 months of the first few months of the pandemic, as we shift the structures of the JCT or the China network, we shift the way that we are doing this, partly for the lessons, partly, of course, because needs change. And we moved from ventilators to PPE, and then we realised that the sort of volumes of PPE that we're going to need to continue to procure are such that we need a slightly different model, and it's one that is more kind of UK or London-based than the one that we'd started with, and also because you've been running what's effectively a crisis operation, drawing on staff who are not fundamentally versed in procurement matters or even healthcare matters, and taking them away from other jobs, and you having to try and get yourself back onto a more sustainable footing. So there's a process of near constant evolution through the course of those first few months. And then lessons are being learned all the time, some of which are immediate and they're being put into practice in changes to the way that we're doing things on the ground, and some of which are longer term.
Pause for a moment, please.
And if I could just ask a question.
Yes.
Going back to Mr Sharma's question and the lesson learned, I understand that you accept the proposition that there may have been a lack of training or expertise. I'm just wondering how you put that lesson that you've learned, or sorry, how your former colleagues put that lesson that's been learned into practice to apply both to business as usual, because presumably your people in China are having to deal with business as usual as well as a pandemic. How do you get the right kind of expertise and training for your people in China? As you say, you couldn't send new people in who were properly trained. So how does that work in practice now?
Well, I
today?
think it's a very good question, because I don't think it would be practical to make every member of the China network a procurement specialist. So what we're trying to do is to try and ensure that we've got higher levels of basic knowledge across the system, and then we've got the procurement policies in place that would enable them in such an eventuality. But it was, as we all know, an extraordinary time in which each and every day, every assumption that we might have made was being thrown up in the air, and we were having to adapt constantly to those changing demands.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr Sharma.
Not at all, my lady. One of the second lessons that Sir Philip Barton places in his witness statement on behalf of the FCO is that there was an absence of clear lines of responsibility between the FCO, the Department for International Trade, and the Department for Health and Social Care. Would you agree with that?
I would, yes. But I think, again, what we're trying to do in the course of the first few weeks and months is to get ourselves to a more sustainable footing, and one in which there's through a kind of crisis period, we've got a demand signal that's coming out of DHSC and that's being implemented by joint teams, FCO and DIT teams. JACT starts as being a kind of primarily FCO team, becomes a joint FCO, DIT, DHSC team, and then modifies itself again and becomes a kind of DIT-led GSEP. So we're evolving constantly.
And this, Mr. Manley, is one of your own, in fact, your principal reflection about the approach to the pandemic. You say this, that if the wider expertise within government, including trade and investment expertise within the Department for the Department for International Trade, had been available to the FCO at an earlier stage, effective procurement processes might have been established sooner.
Yes. We try and bring in this expertise as quickly as we can. If you look at the initial days, I mean, this is those initial messages that we're sending out on this around the 20th of March, days after the pandemic's been declared, and when we're only, I think, realising quite what is happening to global supply chains as well. We then try and one of the lessons that we quickly learn from the JCT is that need to have more DIT staff and expertise in this, and that's what happens kind of within about a week.
One of the ways of solving the problem of expertise is, of course, by training. Another means might be better coordination between the expertise which is available within the United Kingdom and within the FCO. In the event of a pandemic at some point in the future, what do you think the right balance is, the right mix between increasing training on the ground for officials and making sure that there's coordination? Or do you think it's not an either-or question?
Well, I think we probably have to have a little bit of both. But I do think a lot of it is about coordination, and we were hamstrung by the inability to bring in expertise from the UK into the China network because of the pandemic restrictions. But But as those kind of days and weeks go on, we're trying to make best use of that expertise. And I think if we were doing it all again, it's easy to do with hindsight, and we'd have been quicker at it, and I hope we'd be quicker at it again. God forbid we face a similar circumstance.
Thank you, Mr. Manley. I don't have any further questions.
I think there are some questions from Ms Mitchell. No? Oh, I've got... Oh, no, it's for Mr Gove. Sorry. I don't think there are any questions for you, Mr Manley, is that
I
right?
don't believe there are.
Very well. I'm terribly sorry about that. Getting ahead of myself, Mr Manley. Thank you very much indeed for your help. I hope we haven't flown in another diplomat to help us today. I was afraid that we might have flown in Mr Mitchell specially, but you can combine your visit, I hope, with other
Special trip.
special visits. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you
for your
very
help.
much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think you might as well continue, Mr Ward, if you're happy to.
Yes, very happy, lady.
My lady, our next witness this afternoon is Mr. Michael Gove.
Thank you.
I swear, by Almighty God,
That the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Mr Gove, I hope we haven't kept you waiting for too long. That you
not
were
at all.
warned.
No, thank you very much, my lady. No, not at all.
Please state your full name for the inquiry.
Michael Andrew Gove.
Thank you, Mr. Gove, and thank you for supplying to the inquiry a witness statement. It's inquiry document 000563560. It's signed at the end. Could you confirm, please, for the inquiry that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Gove, by way of brief background, you are the former MP for Surrey Heath, is that right?
Yes.
You've held numerous senior roles, including ministerial ones within the Conservative Party, but for the period of relevance to this module, you were the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster between January 2020 and September 2021, is that correct?
Yes.
And you were the Minister for the Cabinet Office from mid-February 2020.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And you are now the editor of The Spectator. You've been so since October of 2024.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Moving on then, please, to your role in pandemic procurement, which is obviously the subject of this module. You've told us in your witness evidence that that role was relatively limited and led by DHSC. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Throughout the period that is relevant to this module, your fellow minister there was Mr. Matt Hancock, from whom we'll be hearing in due course.
Yes.
We know from your evidence also, Mr. Gove, that you attended a range of important decision-making fora, sometimes attending, sometimes chairing, including COBRA, the General Public Service Ministerial Implementation Group, HMIG, Cabinet, COVID-0, and meetings with devolved administrations, yes?
Yes.
And you tell us very candidly, if I may say so, that you have no extensive knowledge of public procurement law. That's the position, isn't it?
Yes.
But you are nonetheless, Mr. Gove, familiar with the importance of ensuring that fairness and transparency is achieved through that process at all times.
Yes, consistent with other priorities.
Yes, I don't know whether you have been able to tune in to last week's evidence at all, have you, Mr. Gove?
I've had the chance to read some of it.
Yes. I don't know whether you have read, therefore, the evidence of Professor Sanchez-Graells. You will then recall a set of principles that govern procurement and his evidence that not just even in an emergency, but especially in an emergency, fairness and transparency are to be maintained.
I read his evidence, both here to the inquiry and also the report that he prepared. I think there are a number of flaws in his analysis.
Well, I'm not going to ask you to critique his analysis. I'm asking you a very specific question about transparency and fairness. Can we limit ourselves for these purposes to that? Would you mind?
I think we better give Mr. Gove the chance to see if he wants. Can you summarise your?
Yes.
Mr. Gove.
So Professor Sanchez-Graels is both an academic and a lawyer, and in his work he exhibits the weaknesses of both of those otherwise admirable professions. He outlines an adherence to EU legacy law, which seems to me to be almost theological in its how can I put this, finickiness. And it is also the case that he seems profoundly to underestimate the degree of pressure under which this and other governments were placed at the beginning of the pandemic. So while I am a huge admirer both of academics and of lawyers, all professions have their flaws, and Professor Sanchez-Graels exhibits both of those flaws in his report.
All right, Mr. Gove, I don't think there's any dispute that you and others, we've heard from some of them last week, were under terrific pressure during this period. The simple point, and it's a point relevant to one of the High Court judgments of which you may be aware, is that even during emergency procurement, it is necessary, it is essential to maintain principles of transparency and fairness. In that particular case, or cases, they related to equal treatment and the publication of contract notices after the event.
Yes, and I take it you're referring to the case that dealt with Pestfix, Clandeboy and Ianda.
I am. They're both Good Law Project cases. They're separate cases. One of them found unequal treatment as a result of the high priority lane, to which we'll come in a few moments. And the other found as a result of notices not having been published within the requisite time or at all, that requirement of transparency had not been met.
Yes, I have a very low opinion of the Good Law Project. I believe that its title is an almost perfect oxymoron. The man who runs it is a politically motivated grifter.
All right, well, thank you for that, Mr. Gove. It wasn't a question I was asking you, but you've said your piece. You do, by contrast, have an enormously high opinion of Lord Agnew, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. And you say so in your written evidence. You delegated authority for issues pertaining to government commercial activity to your junior minister, you say Lord Theodore Agnew. Did he report to you?
Yes.
Yeah. So you were provided with updates so far as his involvement in public procurement was concerned?
Yes, but there would be many decisions that Theodore would take, which in the course of any given day, I would not seek nor wish to micromanage.
Do you have any sense of what proportion of his time was devoted to the challenge of emergency procurement?
A significant amount, but I would not be able to put a percentage upon it.
Okay, thank you for that. You say that he had a vitally important role within the Cabinet Office. You describe him as a linchpin. You use various other adjectives describing him in heroic terms.
Yes.
And indeed, you describe him as a hero.
Yes.
For his role in public procurement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, thank you for that. I want to move on to the subject of the ventilator challenge. You tell us within your written evidence that the procurement, that you did not have any direct decision-making authority or leadership, with the exception of the ventilator challenge.
Yes.
I just want to ask you, in relation to the first clause there, you distinguish presumably direct decision-making authority or leadership and indirect decision-making authority or leadership. Is that fair?
I believe so, but it depends on how you choose to develop this line of questioning.
Well, let's see how we get on. By direct, that is issuing an instruction, a clear instruction. I don't know whether you followed or read Mr. Rhys-Williams' evidence or Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams' evidence of last week.
I did.
You did. You may recall, therefore, in relation to ministerial pressure, that he subdivided that category into three subcategories. There is a request from a minister for an update as to how an offer that has made its way into the VIP lane is progressing. That's number one, which he said, fair enough. Number two, you said you'd get back to me by X and have not done so. Why not? He described that as annoying but fair. And number three, I want you to purchase this or these items from this source, which he described as not okay. Now, the third example would be direct decision-making, would it not? Whereas the first two, indirect.
Yes, but I think that since the example of any contract being awarded at the behest or request of a minister, which resulted in public money going to any contractor, didn't arise.
Sorry, you acknowledge that the third species, the third subcategory that Sir Gareth postulated last week would be direct intervention from a minister, if it existed.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. You say that you had no direct decision-making authority or leadership, with the exception of the ventilator challenge, where you
Yes.
did. Yes?
Yes.
Because you had direct intervention, you had direct involvement and intervention in that challenge.
Well, it may help the inquiry to note that in the ventilator challenge, which followed on from the inability of the government to procure ventilators at a time when they were considered to be a vital element in the response to COVID, the Prime Minister asked the Cabinet Office to lead an innovation partnership type arrangement, during which there were a number of companies, some of them established medical suppliers, one at least not, to see if it was possible at pace to provide the NHS with the equipment that it was at the time so desperately in need of. I believe that the eventual outcome of that was a success, and I believe that Gareth Rhys-Williams and Theodore Agnew deserve enormous credit for it.
All right, well, we heard evidence about the ventilator challenge, as you will know, last week, particularly from Sir Gareth. But since some of that correspondence included or was sent by you, it's important and only fair to you that the inquiry should hear directly from you in relation to it. And that's what I want to move to now, if I may.
Of course.
Thank you. Could we have, therefore, INQ 000 04, sorry, it's quadruple 48399 up on display. As early as the 20th of March 2020, which was 4 days after the ventilator challenge was announced, the Prime Minister, in a WhatsApp messaging group, which I don't think included you,
No, it did not.
was messaging about ventilators. And he said this, Dyson freaking, then we have action this day. Mr. Hancock says, I have also received the same. I will talk to Dyson and Michael, which I presume is yourself,
Yes.
and sort it. Were you at this point informed that Sir James Dyson was freaking?
I was certainly informed, I don't know if it was precisely at this point, I was certainly informed at different points of the frustrations that Sir James Dyson felt with the process of Dyson, the company's involvement in the ventilator challenge.
Was pressure being applied to you to include Dyson in the ventilator challenge and to progress its design?
Pressure was being applied to me to ensure that we got ventilators to the front line, and the decision to take procurement of ventilators out of DHSC and into the Cabinet Office for the ventilator challenge was a reflection of the Prime Minister's judgment that DHSC was doing an enormous amount under pressure, and that Sir Gareth, because he had some experience in this area, could help us to secure those supplies. A number of different companies were involved in that process, the most high profile of which, to those who would not have been involved in the field of medical equipment, would obviously have been Sir James.
I note that, save for that last part of your answer, you have answered in general terms. We're going to turn on to the detail in a moment, but can I ask you directly, did you have as much or more direct involvement in any other potential ventilator manufacturer as you did with Dyson?
I looked at all of the designs. I spent my time trying to ensure that the process was happening as quickly as possible. What I wanted to ensure was that all viable designs were followed up. The difference between Sir James and others is that he has not, or had not, primarily been involved in making medical equipment, but what he was and is an entrepreneur, innovator, inventor, and designer of distinction who had been contacted by the Prime Minister and who had indicated his willingness to help at a time of national challenge.
Mr. Gove, it's not quite what I asked you. Can I take you back to my question, please? And I think it's one that permits for a yes or no answer. Did you have as much direct involvement with any other potential ventilator manufacturer as you did with Dyson?
No, not as much as with Dyson.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to be clear about. Clearly, as you've indicated in your answers this afternoon, Sir James was very active in pushing to be involved. We know that, don't we?
He wanted to save lives.
He wanted to save lives. We know of this. Could we have another document for which you are not responsible, but in which you are mentioned? INQ 000569777, page 11, which is a rather well-thumbed copy of Mr. Hancock's pandemic diaries. It's 25th of March 2020. Boris called Michael Gove and me in to talk ventilators. He wants Michael to pick it up, given all the procurement people are actually based in the Cabinet Office. Our competition is proving a mixed blessing. Some participants are a little over-enthusiastic. James Dyson, the vacuum manufacturer, has been contacting numerous people in high places to ensure he has a prominent role. He's continually on the phone, including to Boris, pushing to take part. He's an amazing innovator and engineer, and he's completely right to turn to this. After all, we put out the call, but it's becoming awkward. And then further down, Michael texted asking to talk urgently about what to do about Dyson. It's a fine line between enthusiasm and getting in the way. All right, would you agree with that assessment? Was it becoming awkward?
It was the case that Sir James was frustrated at what he perceived to be bureaucratic slowness on the part of the government machine. Part of my role was to challenge the bureaucracy within the government machine at every point, not just on behalf of Sir James, but on behalf of the National Health Service and those at the front line. Sir James has a particularly energetic style of making himself known. So do I.
You speak within your witness statement about the political pressure that Sir James is capable of exerting. What do you mean by that? And did it come to bear on you?
If it was the case that at any point someone who was willing to help the front line had been fobbed off with bureaucratic excuses, and if their kind efforts had not been followed up energetically, that would have been a political problem, but worse than that, it would have been a failure to discharge my duty as a minister seeking to help the front line.
Is that your assessment of the Dyson proposal, that Sir James was fobbed off?
It was the case that he communicated to me and to others frustration with the process. So I set out at different points in order to see if aspects of the process that might be conducted sequentially could be conducted in parallel. I asked questions about whether or not space in some of the testing facilities, which I believe were in Birmingham, could be freed in order to ensure that the process of advancing different prototypes could be done. At that time, my main aim was to ensure that we had the maximum number of potential ventilators from the maximum number of suppliers. And I think it was noted in the evidence that Sir James, because of his production facilities, had his prototype got through testing, which it didn't, would have been able to produce significant numbers.
Were you capable of forming a view as to which side of the line his proposals fell, enthusiasm and getting in the way?
I think that it's in the nature of government that every single day people who are enthusiastic sometimes also get in the way. So it may be the case that there are people who maintain a Aristotelian golden mean between enthusiasm and getting in the way. But normally, in the rough and tumble of politics and government, sometimes the best people, the most energetic people, can overreach. But you want to have people who are capable of either asking difficult questions or being demanding. That's the price of progress.
Mr. Gove, you relied, as all ministers must, on the advice of senior civil servants.
Yes.
Yeah. And you heard, did you not, then and last week in evidence, Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams' significant concerns about the safety of the ventilator prototype being proposed by Dyson?
Yes.
Yeah. Were you aware of those concerns both at the time? You presumably are aware that that was the evidence given last week.
Yes, of course I was.
Were you aware at the time?
Yes, of course I was.
Yes.
So the reason why I pressed was to see if it was possible to refine the design, and indeed the design was refined, and some, but not all, of the obstacles to its implementation were addressed.
Well,
but throughout, we were very clear that no device should be deployed on the front line unless it had secured approval from the MHRA.
Because of the fundamental importance of ensuring safety in a piece of apparatus such as a ventilator.
Correct.
Yeah. All right, let's turn to some of the relevant correspondence and test the degree to which it matches up with the account that you now give. Could we have INQ 0004966 699? It's an email dated the 25th of March 2020 from Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams to Sir John Manzoni. CDL, that's yourself. Insistent, in capital letters, we place an order with Dyson, contingent on passing clinical and passing MHRA approvals. They are working at full speed already, but if that's what CDL wants, ... All right, that's the first one. Before I put a question to you, I'm going to bring up onto the screen the second one. The same day, it's INQ 0005333 247. The same day, Richard Hornby, the Chief Financial Officer at the Cabinet Office, with whom I'm sure you're familiar, emailed Cabinet Office colleagues saying, please accept this as authorisation to raise a purchase order for £100,000 in favour of Dyson for prototype ventilators. Gareth Rhys-Williams has been instructed by CDL to proceed at pace. Description and conditions will come from Gareth and Dan. Thanks and happy to discuss. And then one more before I pose a question to you, if I may. It's INQ 000497116. And this is a few days later. Yes, there it is. If we just scroll up, we'll see who this comes from. It's from, yes, it's from your office.
Yes.
Dear all, and there are a number of action points there. Do you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down? MHRA, that's the regulatory body responsible for ensuring safety. And GRW, Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams, to ensure by the end of Friday, and this is written on a Wednesday, to ensure by the end of Friday the Dyson product has first been tested and second has been approved by MHRA. Now, Mr. Gove, given what you say about the importance of safety, given that you say that you regarded your role only as one of unblocking bureaucracy, how was it that you were able, on Wednesday, the 25th of March, to give a clear instruction that not only would the Dyson product have been tested 3 days later, but also approved by MHRA by that time?
I could not tell the MHRA what to approve and would not. I think that this is private office shorthand for we would hope that it had been tested and, if tested satisfactorily, approved by the MHRA to that timescale. I was anxious to ensure at all points that if we could, that we had products that could save lives operating at the front line. But it's absurd to imagine that I or any other minister could instruct the MHRA, an independent regulatory agency, to approve a product. If I had told the MHRA to approve a product, they would have told me where to get off.
Well, Mr. Gove, that's the reason that the question's been put to you. Let's see how others on this email string interpreted what it was that you were doing at this point. Could we scroll up a little bit? Up to the top. Yes, there it is. This is from Graham Tunbridge from the MHRA itself. The readout from CDL's private office and a response by John Manzoni are below. In short, you will see that CDL was keen to press forward with Dyson's proposal to a timescale that is totally unrealistic. Well, that's one point. That's going too fast, going faster than we are capable of achieving.
Yes.
Safely. Based in part on promises made by Dyson that are already not being fulfilled. In addition, however, CDL did not appreciate the level of risk involved in the manufacture and use of ventilators and wanted to circumvent the expedited regulatory process that has been put in place. Note the word circumvent. Strong language for a regulatory body charged with ensuring the crucial safety of devices used to maintain life.
Completely. But what I was doing and did throughout was at every stage ask if there was any way in which this process could be accelerated. Why? Because I wished to see ventilators placed at the disposal of the NHS at a time when it was felt that we needed them, and we needed them delivered at scale. So whether or not Graham Tunbridge was in any of the meetings, I'm not sure that he was in many, if he had been, or if others had been, they would have been able to tell you that I was asking a series of questions in order to ensure that the process was as efficient, effective, and fast as possible. But whenever confronted with brute facts about safety or otherwise, I would always accept them. It's the role of ministers to challenge, and indeed, one of the conclusions of an earlier module of the inquiry was that ministers have to challenge the advice they are given.
Mr. Gove, you've said that in answer to previous questions, but it does seem from this email correspondence that what you were doing is stepping beyond that role and mandating a regulatory body to do neither what it could within a given time frame, nor what it might not end up doing, depending on the result of its testing.
No, that's not true.
Forgive me, Mr. Gove. I'm not sure that's a fair way of putting it, Mr. Hall. The idea that a third party comes up with the word circumvent does not mean that Mr. Gove is trying to circumvent. I think we need to be careful.
Mr. Gove, you've given your evidence. You were not seeking to circumvent the role of the MHRA.
No, and it's ludicrous to imagine that any minister could have done. Just imagine the situation, if you will. A minister, Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, says we want to have a potentially lethal machine in hospitals deliberately so that we can meet an arbitrary deadline. It's inconceivable.
All right, Mr. Gove, let's just finish up on this string of correspondence. Could we have INQ 000534490? And this is a further, I just want you to have the opportunity to respond to this, if you would. This is Sir Gareth, 25th of March.
Yes.
Suggestions what to do. I do feel that CDL, this is you, is being unreasonable. Even if he was correct that we had delayed anything, which I don't believe he is at all, his tone is regrettable. But see below, it would appear that the Dyson sample is just not ready to be shipped by them. MHRA could have been testing something else this evening. In the meanwhile, we are getting, of course, more test rigs for them so that it is no bottleneck. Now, there is a new point expressed in this email, which is the opportunity cost, which is the time, the effort that is being devoted to Dyson meant that that time, that effort, could not be devoted to other ventilator proposals of the type that you were describing earlier, fell to be considered and that you would have considered. Is that a fair point, Mr. Gove?
I don't believe that it is. So I think that the first thing to say is that there are always trade-offs in this process. The second thing to say is that, as Gareth Rhys-Williams pointed out, in the end, the Ventilator Challenge, thanks to his leadership more than anyone's, and also Theodore Agnew's, was able to produce products in weeks that would ordinarily have taken months, if not years. The third thing to say is that at any given point, the MHRA laboratory would have been, the people there would have been working flat out. I also believe the people at Dyson were working flat out, but it might have been the case that Dyson's ability to bring the improved product to the laboratory in time on this occasion was found wanting. But I think in the greater scheme of things, the loss of time, the opportunity cost would have been nugatory.
Can I ask this? Do you think this is fair, Mr. Gove, that you put a great deal of pressure, part of your job, as you've said, because you understood the Dyson prototype was viable when it wasn't?
Well, I think that's at the heart of it, my lady. I, by definition, I'm not an expert, the MHRA are, in deciding whether or not a prototype is suitable for deployment. What I do have experience of is pushing bureaucracies, and sometimes I can be unreasonable and rebarbative in tone. And I apologise for that, but I think that in this case, what I was seeking to do was to see if an opportunity existed to produce ventilators from a source which, if they were viable, would have been capable of producing them at a scale and in a number greater than any of the other rivals.
Well, Ellie, I note the time, but I'm quite close to concluding this topic. If
carry on,
if you're
please.
content to continue for a few
course.
moments. Could we have inquiry 000536 361, please, brought up onto the screen? Now, this concern from Sir Gareth led Sir John Manzoni to intervene personally with the MHRA, and he has provided in his witness statement the following. He says, I can recall that I was concerned that, by virtue of the meeting being called by CDL, indirect pressure was being placed on the MHRA indirect pressure to approve the supplier's design at the stage of selecting suppliers to progress in the ventilator challenge. I felt I had to and did intervene in this meeting to ensure that the MHRA approval system, as the regulatory system, was properly applied and to protect the integrity of the process. Now, again, strong words. According to Sir John Manzoni there was a need to protect the integrity of the process. Do you agree that such a need did arise?
No. I believe that I respected the integrity of the process throughout. What I wanted to ensure was that it was being implemented, appropriate processes, as effectively as possible. There's a distinction, I think, to be drawn between the ability of an agency or regulator to determine whether or not technical specifications have been met, and also the speed and effectiveness with which the bureaucracy overseeing that is operating.
You mentioned that the Dyson proposal had the support of the Prime Minister himself.
Well, the original drive to secure additional ventilators had come from the Prime Minister. He was the author of the Ventilator Challenge and therefore deserves credit for ensuring that we did actually secure additional ventilators faster than might otherwise have been the case. It was also the case that the Prime Minister, I believe, set out to encourage a number of British industrialists to help, of whom Sir James Dyson was one. I also believe that McLaren, the sports car manufacturer, were also contacted because some of the facilities that they had at their disposal were potentially capable of aiding in that effort.
But as far as you're aware, well, we haven't found documentation within the inquiry that suggests that you promoted or supported a particular proposal in the way that you have done here. Is that correct?
I was very interested in all of the proposals, but the critical thing about Sir James and Dyson is that they had the capacity, as I mentioned earlier, to produce at scale. Most of the other companies were smaller scale, though in the end, as I think Gareth Rhys-Williams recorded in his evidence, Smiths and Penlon in particular, I think, really rose to the occasion. But I remember having detailed conversations at a very early stage in the process with Gareth and others in order to understand what was required of each of the potential consortia. I think one of the consortia that McLaren were part of fell away relatively early on. I can't recall all of them, but I was just anxious to see that they all contributed. And I also felt, as I say, that given Sir James and his team had a record of deploying ingenious solutions to intractable problems, the fact that they were involved was an asset.
Final question on this topic, Mr. Gove. Looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, it's always very helpful to have that benefit. Any regrets? Do you have any regrets in the way in which the Dyson matter was handled, or the proposal was handled?
No, I don't, because I think it's right to acknowledge that Sir James, having sought very hard to ensure that he could provide a viable ventilator, in the end bore the costs himself of the work that he had carried out at risk. And he's a man of means, but I think that he or his company bore costs of £20 million. The reason he was acting as he was is because he believed that he wanted to help the NHS. I think that there's been a focus on Sir James because it was erroneously suggested that he was a donor to the Conservative Party. The BBC had to apologise when it was pointed out that was not the case. Sir James inevitably attracts attention and controversy because of his support for Brexit. But I think that the overall ventilator challenge, as I say, worked well, and everyone within it, particularly, as I say, Gareth Rhys-Williams and Theodore Agnew, deserve thanks and credit.
And just arising out of that answer, if I may, Mr. Gove, you say under the heading conflicts of interest in your evidence, paragraph 92, you say that no pressure was or could be applied to award any individual or company a contract. I passed on every request I received in the manner of a postman, delivering communications from potential seller to discriminating buyer with neither endorsement nor stigma. Does that description that you offer at paragraph 92 apply to the Dyson example?
I think that at paragraph 92, I'm referring explicitly to PPE and to the high priority lane. The ventilator challenge was a different exercise, as I've explained. And I think that the proof of its success rests in the evidence that we heard from Gareth Rhys-Williams and others. Of course, as the inquiry knows, as our understanding of the virus evolved and our understanding of treatment of those who suffered from the virus evolved, the need for ventilation, an invasive procedure in any case, was superseded by other treatments. But the line of questioning, the heuristic which is being applied, is that there was something somehow wrong about Sir James Dyson's involvement or the energetic championing of him. In the end, as I say, Sir James lost money trying to help the NHS, driving the machine hard in order to ensure that we had additional ventilators resulted in success. One of the problems governing debate outside this inquiry on procurement is that individuals like Jolyon Maugham and others have sought to suggest there was something somehow fishy, stinky or corrupt about this process that is, as I say in my statement, politically motivated bilge.
Thank you.
I think that's a moment to take a break, Mr. Wald. You remember, Mr. Gove, we take breaks for the stenographer, and I promise you we will finish your evidence today, and I shall return at 25 to. All right. Mr. Wald.
Mr. Gove, I want to turn now to the subject of the VIP lane, if I may. You make it very clear in your evidence that you were not responsible for setting it up. You had no hand in that. In fact, you didn't even know about it until at some point afterwards. Do you remember how long after it was set up that you learned of it?
I can't remember exactly, no. I think I was made aware of it by media reporting.
Yeah, you say so in your statement.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Yeah. You may have read or heard last week's witnesses. None of them would favour a reinstatement of a VIP lane or a high priority lane in the event of a future pandemic which called for emergency procurement. I assume that you would align yourself with those witnesses, that you would not support or press for or advocate for the reintroduction of the VIP lane or the high priority lane.
No, I don't believe so. I think that as one reflects on procurement, both the successes and the failures, I think that the issue of the VIP or high priority lane is a marginal one, but I wouldn't certainly strive to reinstate such an arrangement in any future pandemic preparedness.
No.
But I do believe that the focus and attention that has been directed towards the high priority lane as one of the principal defects in our approach towards procurement is disproportionate.
Okay, well, that's a fair observation. There's the optics of it, but then there's the actual functioning of it. We touched upon the High Court challenges. The VIP lane was found to be unlawful on grounds of unequal treatment. So it's not purely a matter of optics, is it, Mr. Gove?
Well, I've read Mrs. Justice O'Farrell's judgment, and indeed you are right that its operation was found to be unlawful. But it's also the case, I think, that the judgment concludes that the contracts would have been awarded to those respective bidders in any case. And I also think it's important to bear in mind the point that's made by, several points that are made by Nigel Boardman in his report, his review into procurement overall. He makes the point that government needs to be willing to experiment simultaneously with several potential solutions, acknowledging that some of them might not work, given the nature and the scale of emergency procedures.
Mr. Gove, I'll come in due course to invite you to offer your view on what alternative solutions might look like, particularly given your wealth of experience in government.
Thank you.
But just to respond, if I may, and ask you a further question based on what you've just said. You're right, of course, that in the case where unequal treatment was found, it was also found that the particular contracts that were there being considered would have been awarded in any event.
Yes.
Yeah. But we are, in this inquiry, focused on systems, aren't we? And so we are looking, as we must, at finding better ways of emergency procuring in the future. So the fact that a particular contract or three may or may not have received an award ultimately is, to use your language, marginal. It's not really the crux of the matter, is it, Mr. Gove?
Well, again, I think there have been various attempts, statistical attempts, to suggest that somehow the high priority lane massively distorted the process of procurement. And I think, again, there are deeper and more profound problems with procurement, both as we saw during the pandemic and more broadly, than the operation of the high priority lane.
All right. As I said, I will come back to it. You've offered a page or so of reflections at the end of your witness statements, and I want to ask you briefly about those towards the end.
Thank you.
You've told us within your written statement that as a high priority minister with a coordinating role during the pandemic, you were often in receipt of a very large number of offers of assistance. And you cite the example of one of them your then Shadow Minister, Rachel Reeves MP.
Yes.
Yeah, and you provided a response to Rachel Reeves, who was requesting an update in relation to a number of offers. Let's have a look, if we may, at your response. It's INQ 000512 941. It's dated the 2nd of May 2020, so it postdates the existence of the high priority lane. Were you aware of it by now? Do you know?
I can't recall if I was specifically aware of it at that time.
Okay, very fair. You've said that if businesses yes, there we are. The government has set up clear routes for businesses to use if they want to help with the response to COVID-19 and we encourage all potential offers to be directed to the following web form. If businesses use this web form, it ensures that their offer is entered into our system effectively and allows the appropriate team to take it forward. As you would expect, all offers are triaged by officials. We're focusing on prioritising these, which can deliver significant quantities of high-quality equipment to the health and care sector. So there, Mr Gove, you appear to be describing what on the face of it looks like a sensible method of receiving and triaging offers, but which is not the VIP lane. Yeah?
Yes.
So would this, you said that you weren't sure whether or not at the time of writing this letter you were aware of an alternative VIP lane. Whether or not you were so aware, would what you are describing here to Rachel Reeves not serve as a method of receiving offers that would not encounter some of the problems, whether identified by the High Court or by others, of the VIP or high priority lane?
I think the particular web form here and the particular portal that we had operating was not perhaps providing the rapidity of response that a number of members of Parliament hoped to see at a time when there was an urgent need to secure PPE. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the original letter that Rachel Reeves sent me.
I have seen that letter.
And as you will see, in it, Rachel Reeves listed 20 or so potential sources of PPE. The charge, quite properly, as an opposition spokesperson that she was making, is that we were being laggardly in pursuing these particular offers. And in my response, I made it clear that some of those offers, generously meant, were not offers that it was worth pursuing. One was from a theatrical costumier, another from a football agent, and so on.
You refer to it at the bottom of this document.
Exactly.
The annex to your letter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I make no criticism at all of Rachel Reeves because there were any number of members of Parliament and others who were seeking to ensure that generous-hearted and kindly meant offers were being processed. I provided Rachel with the official means by which we were gatekeeping those offers. But I think it is fair to say that it was a legitimate question on the part of Rachel Reeves and others. Were we doing enough to ensure that offers were followed up?
As to rapidity, Mr Gove, you are aware, are you not, of the rapid response team that was able to provide a 24-hour response time to an initial offer and then to maintain a rapid response through the process where appropriate?
Yes, but not every offer received a response that rapid.
No, it was a matter of triage, it was a matter of judgment of the offer, whether or not it did receive such treatment.
Yes, but the initially, at least, the scale of offers that were made meant that not everyone was responded to as quickly as they might have been. And there were a number of members of Parliament who would contact me and other ministers and indeed others within government saying, I've made this offer. I believe this offer is profoundly helpful. And it took longer than 24 hours for them to receive an appropriate response.
If we could keep this document on the screen for a moment. Mr Gove, by contrast, the VIP lane enabled an offer to come in to consideration and received prioritisation merely by dint of who it was that was referring it in. So unlike the rapid response team, unlike the web form that you explained as an option to Rachel Reeves, it offered an advantage simply that derived from a personal contact. That's right, isn't it?
Not only from personal contact. Some for entrance to the high priority lane, some were referred on the basis of the personal contact. Some were referred on the basis of their turnover and their assessed capacity to deliver as being significant players in the field, yes.
But it was a limited category of person that was able to make a reference into the VIP or high priority lane, was it not?
Well, first of all, it's not the case that things were referred to the high priority lane. The high priority lane took referrals that had come from a variety of people. So forgive me making this distinction, and it is a distinction with a difference. Certainly in the initial phases of the pandemic, I or anyone else would pass on offers within the team that was responsible for assessing offers. A high priority lane was set up, and ministers were subsequently made aware that offers that they had referred and offers that were also referred from MPs, senior officials and peers went through that lane. It's also the case, I think, that there were some offers that came from the FCDO and others that were also referred to that lane as well.
You've made it very clear, Mr. Gove, in your evidence that when you were in receipt of an offer, you acted as a postman. You didn't seek to assess it, to triage it. You passed it on.
Yes, it would be very difficult for me to have made that assessment. And indeed, fundamentally, there was an 8-stage process, which I believe Jonathan Marin outlined last week, to determine whether or not a contract would eventually be awarded. It might be the case that I could say this individual or this organisation is clearly a respectable business, or this individual is an eccentric who's forwarded something that is inappropriate. But in most cases, the people who would contact me would appear to be businesses that were capable, at the very least, of operating effectively. The high priority lane would then conduct an initial assessment, and then after that there were 2 more processes that had to go through. So the high priority lane, like the Make team and the China team, was, as it were, a tributary that went into the broader reservoir, and then from that reservoir a variety of tests were applied.
Mr. Gove, thank you. It wasn't a criticism, and I note the time. We've got a bit to get through, so if we could try and keep the answers a little bit more succinct, that would help us all enormously. Thank you very much. The reason I've kept this document up on the screen is that you'll see that you wrote in your 3rd paragraph, the response to help with the national effort against this pandemic has been overwhelming. And I'm sure you'll join me in commending the extraordinary efforts of British businesses and individuals. Now, you will be aware from last week, in relation to the call to arms, of the evidence that we heard, that it proved to be counterproductive. I know it wasn't your idea. Do you share the view that that call to arms was a counterproductive measure?
Well, I think it would have been very difficult for any government not to welcome offers of PPE at a time when the principal concern was its absence. So the principal concern, not just in the United Kingdom, but across Europe, was that frontline professionals were being put in a position of danger because of the lack of that equipment. And there was a worldwide excess of demand over supply. So any government that wasn't doing everything that it could in order to secure PPE would undoubtedly be criticised, and individuals who thought they might be able to help, good-hearted individuals, shouldn't have been, dissuaded.
Mr. Gove, when you say very difficult, you mean politically difficult, don't you? You mean that the political pressure was to invite further offers of PPE when the existing offers were already overwhelming?
Well, we couldn't willingly turn away individuals who might be able to help.
That's a different point, Mr.
Yes,
Gove.
but
I'm asking about the call to arms, the request for further offers when the existing offers were overwhelming those individuals that were busily triaging, sifting out the good from the bad.
It's certainly the case that the individuals concerned faced an enormous wave of offers, but I don't believe that it would have been possible to stem that wave, as it were. And it was quite right that we should seek to ensure that we got the maximum number of credible offers dealt with as quickly as possible.
Before I move on, a contrary view, it's clearly not your view, would be that we have an abundance of offers. We should focus our resources now on sifting out within that source those offers that are credible, those offers that are good, those offers that we should take forward, and that however great the political pressure to make announcements, to invite further offers, one should refrain from doing that in order to allow those responsible for emergency procurement to get on and do their jobs.
Well, by definition, one could not know before assessing the offers how many of them would be viable. So I absolutely take the point that the number of offers was significant and difficult for the team to process. But until that work of processing starts, one cannot know which offers are meritorious. I would add that the existence of the different streams, the China stream, the Make stream, and so on, was an effort to ensure that bets were placed on as many horses as possible because we did not know which of them would finish the course.
So to that point, Mr. Gove, did you follow Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams' evidence in which he expressly advises against a call to arms shortly before it is made? And
Yes.
he does that on the basis of his experience of the ventilator call to arms and the disruption that that had caused. So I'm going to suggest to you that it was then possible, if ministers were prepared to follow the advice of senior civil servants who were closer to the practicalities of all this, to refrain from exacerbating a problem of offer flow. That was possible at the time, was it not?
I think it's generally the case in almost any process that ministers will want things to go faster, and civil servants will say, actually, we're moving just as fast as we can. And sometimes the ministers will be right to press for greater pace. Sometimes the civil servants will be right to push back against such impatience. It is impossible to know ex ante, to use Gareth's phrase, whether or not the ministers will be vindicated in their impatience or the civil servants will be vindicated in their caution.
We're going to come on, as I said we would, to reflections, ways in which matters could be improved in the event of a future pandemic and emergency procurement. Just since we're on the topic now, is one of those ways to provide more space and freedom for those involved in the difficult day job of emergency procurement to escape what has been described as the noise, the distraction, the interference of ministers that perhaps for valid motives are seeking either updates or explanations for why a particular offer has not been progressed, or even, to identify the third of Sir Gareth's possibilities, mandating a particular outcome. Would it not be beneficial to have a system in the future that protected civil servants from that sort of ministerial interference?
Absolutely not. I think that would be totally counterproductive. And I think it misunderstands democratic accountability. Ministers are accountable to Parliament for the government's response to a variety of events, including this crisis. The opposition will quite rightly question ministers and say, have you improved this process? Are you procuring things at the right level? Have you got the right approach towards lockdown or whatever? And if it is the case that ministers blandly come back and say, well, the civil servants are doing their very best and you should just quieten down there, then that is no way of maintaining democratic accountability. Now, inevitably, sometimes ministerial judgment will be wrong, but ultimately, the ministers are accountable, and that's the way that Parliament and our democracy should operate.
Mr. Gove, bear in mind that the question I posed was within very narrow bounds, because we're talking about emergency procurement.
Yes.
We're talking about a specific situation about which we now know quite a lot through evidence that has been received by the inquiry, and the pressure that was brought to bear on those responsible for procuring essential PPE and other essential medical kit. Now, we know from the evidence of Sir Gareth, from Jonathan Marron, from others, that the call to arms only made their experience more difficult.
Yes.
And we know also from Sir Gareth that that was what he anticipated would happen and advised against. So let me put the question again, but within more narrow bounds as it was before. Even in an emergency situation such as that, would you not countenance some adjustment to that normal democratic principle that you espouse?
No. I think it's all the more important in emergency circumstances that there is clear democratic accountability. I think in a previous module, and certainly in some of the evidence that has been examined, there's an email that I sent quite early on in the pandemic and early on in March, in which I asked a variety of questions. And the reason that I asked those, as other ministers did, was to satisfy ourselves that the situation was being taken sufficiently seriously. It's not for me to prejudge any of the inquiry's conclusions, obviously, but I think one of the things that evidence in other modules would seem to indicate and to reinforce is that perhaps ministers at an earlier stage in the pandemic should have been more energetic and more aggressive in questioning some of the advice that we were being given. And so at different times, as I say, the cautious Charlies will be correct. At other times, the impatient Ians will be correct. But on the whole, I think that it is absolutely right for ministers to challenge and then be held accountable.
Are we back to your Daft Laddie questions, Mr. Gove?
To an extent, yes, my lady, yes.
Mr. Gove, I think we're in the home straight. For the stenographer, if you could slow down a little.
I apologise.
For me, if you wouldn't mind slightly more succinct.
Yep, I'll try.
Thank you. That'd be enormously appreciated. Let's move on to your own role in the VIP lane. You had some involvement in the Mellor Designs offer, didn't you? And David Mellor is a personal friend of yours.
Yes, great personal friend.
A great personal friend. He supported you financially in one of your bids to become the Conservative Party leader. Is that right?
Yes, he's a very shrewd businessman, but on that occasion he got it wrong.
Well, he didn't support you in the other bid to become leader.
No.
Well, he got it right on that occasion.
I think you can say that's true, as indeed did the country.
No comment, Mr. Gove. Let's first establish how Mr. Mellor was introduced to the HPL. I think he first came in without your involvement. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I'm not sure. I can't recall precisely whether or not it was because he was approached by Andrew Feldman, Lord Feldman, or approached by one of my special advisors without my knowledge at the time.
In any event, he contacted your private office, I think, a full week before he contacted you. Is that correct?
I think that's right, yes.
Yes, I was somewhat curious. Why would that have been? Would it have been so well known that he was a friend of yours within your private office that his contact would have been taken forward and accepted?
No, I think it was because, as I say, I can't remember whether or not it was Andrew Feldman or Henry Newman, my special advisor, who had contacted him. He was known to be, his whole business was particularly to source textiles and other products and to provide them for retailers. So I think it was presumed that he might have some expertise in this area. One thing that was always the case, though, was that my private office was told and was aware that he was a friend of mine and that he had donated money to my political campaigning activity in the past, and therefore that any approach should be treated with particular care. In other words, he should not be, what's the word?
Favoritised.
Treated, yeah, exactly. Precisely in order to ensure that that was the case.
And what I want to do with you in the time that remains is to see whether the correspondence suggests that he was favoritised on the basis that he was a close personal friend of yours, or whether instead that friendship meant that he was treated with additional caution. I want to look at each of the emails and invite you to comment on which of those two things is happening. So let's situate ourselves first with INQ 000563687. 687. Now, this, I think, is before your involvement. This was the initial contact with your private office. There are two emails, one of the 19th and I think one of the 25th that we don't necessarily need to bring up. Not sure who this person is, so I only began to support someone who's been redacted out on it yesterday. But I think this will be of use for someone. You were then called, I think, by Mr. Mellor,
Yes,
and you spoke to him on the 26th of March.
I believe that's correct.
Do you remember what the content of that call was?
I don't recall it in detail, but I do believe that he was expressing concern that his offer to source and provide PPE was not being taken up as energetically as it might.
Yeah. Now, already, Mr. Mellor is receiving treatment that those companies or their directors that were drawn to your attention by Rachel Reeves did not receive. Is that a fair observation?
Well, I think
Or did they receive that treatment?
they did receive that treatment.
By whom? Who was there, as we'll come to see in the correspondence, who was their champion, or who was supporting their offers?
We went to great lengths to investigate all of those offers because they had been placed on the public domain by Rachel, and if we hadn't followed them up, she would quite rightly have excoriated us.
But that's a slightly different point, isn't it, Mr. Gove? I appreciate that investigation was undertaken about those companies.
Yes.
But what we see here, I mean, we can cut to it because you were involved and you know, is your involvement in making sure that the offer is properly considered, goes through the system at a reasonable pace.
Yes. Well, I think it
So
is.
that's the aspect of the treatment that I wondered whether you were able to say that those companies mentioned by Rachel Reeves also received, not investigation, but chivying along.
Well, most of them couldn't supply PPE. You know, the theatrical costumier could not supply PPE. So it would have been, I think, eccentric. It might have been an eccentric piece of chivalry on my part to have championed the theatrical costumier that
Mr.
Rachel
Gove,
had mentioned.
If I may, you said to us a few moments ago that you regarded yourself as a postbox.
Yes.
All you knew about this offer is that it came from a good friend. You knew nothing more about what it was that was being offered, at what price, within what time frame.
No, but what I would do, if I may.
By all means, but let's just deal with this point before you move on to whatever it is.
I think.
So my question to you again, Mr.
Yes.
Gove, was this. Already we are seeing, through contact with your private office, through a phone call with you, through emails that we're about to look at, involvement, treatment, chivying along that Mr. Mellor receives, that those companies, investigated though they might have been, did not receive. Is that not a version of unequal treatment?
No, because none, I think only one of the 20 companies that Rachel Reeves wrote to me about actually would have been capable under any circumstances of providing PPE. I'll say two.
Mr. Gove, you've gone back to it. We're getting into a loop. Nor did you know whether any of this offer was viable because, as you quite rightly said, you didn't have the time, the capacity to assess offers. All you knew about Mr. Mellor's offer initially, and actually eventually, was that it had come from Mr. Mellor.
Firstly, in the Rachel Reeves list, I did ask that they be looked at closely. Secondly, that there are available to the inquiry, in fact shared with the inquiry and referred to in my witness statement, a variety, a plethora of emails of me acting on behalf of people who were concerned. So there's a case that was put forward by the Member of Parliament for Romford, in which people in my private office say to Matt Hancock's private office, we are getting hammered by people chasing their offers of PPE, ventilators, etc., who are saying they've tried to contact the teams but have heard nothing back. I'm sure your spares and ministers are also being inundated. Is there a better way for us to handle all of these chases? And then, again, it was the case that there was an organisation called UK Civil Air Patrol, which I'd never heard of before. And again, around the same time, thanks. CDL is keen it's progressed, so can the team managing the inbox note this, please? He, that is me, is getting increasingly frustrated that people contacting him about their offer are not being progressed. Absolutely understand everyone is doing their best, but it just helps with ministerial handling and assurance that we are kept up to speed on progress where possible.
All right.
So there are not an infinite, but scores of examples of me chivying
Yes.
when there are halfway credible efforts.
Mr. Gove, let's follow the Mellor example through. Let's do two things. We were going to consider as we go along whether references to your good friendship with him was, as you suggest, in order to make sure that no favouritism was given, or by contrast and instead, whether it was the opposite. But why don't we, at the same time, just consider, let's wait until we've got to the end of it, whether there were other examples that received that sort of treatment. All right, so let's go to INQ 000 533 868, please, and page 4. This is an email dated the 3rd of April. I've just spoken to David Mellor, brackets, a good friend of Michael Gove, who was asked to source PP3 masks in China. He's managed to do so and has been given a verbal commitment of 40 million masks. This, as you'll see below, has come through the MOD, not sure why. He now has an urgent order to secure 5 million in Holland and the balance in China. Now, you would say, would you, Mr. Gove, that the reference to Mr. Mellor being a good friend of yours is to signal that any form of favouritism must be scrupulously avoided? Is that why it's included in the email?
Well, I don't know why Andrew, who's someone for whom I have the highest regard, would have put that in. It may have been to close the loop or to provide additional information. I think there's a difference between my private office, which would act as the chaser, and would have been aware of all of the connections or relationships that I might have had with anyone who was seeking to land a contract, and Andrew, who was enlisted by DHSC to deliberately seek out the type of people who might be able to provide PPE.
On the face of it, Mr. Gove, the mere inclusion of the reference without the caveat or the caution that you suggest would lead one to assume that this is an offer that we ought to take particularly seriously because of the friendship or the good friendship that this person making this offer has to Michael Gove. Yes?
That is one inference.
Let's have a look at the next email in the chain. It's INQ 000 534 695. It's dated the following day. It's Mr. Canduff to the Cabinet Office. We heard from Mr. Canduff last week.
Yeah.
He says this: there's been multiple conversations with Mr. Mellor, which are ongoing, but he keeps separately contacting private officers, even while conversations with our team are continuing. Unfortunately, that means he's generating a lot of noise in the system. Please do not mention that validation check to him or anyone else. If he contacts either of you again, please direct him to this mailbox.
Yeah.
Going through multiple routes is actually slowing things, as we need to respond to each of the points of contact. It's not speeding them up.
No.
This is the third separate inquiry I've received about Mr. Mellor since yesterday evening. Now, slightly different point here, but we heard last week about noise, about distractions.
quite.
This was consuming quite a lot of bandwidth amongst those whose responsibility it was to triage offers. It's possible that there comes a point where the chasing the request for feedbacks, the chivying, interferes with the day job.
Yes, I think that's entirely fair.
Yeah, and that is the anxiety, the concern that is here being expressed, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's one that I expressed myself.
All right. It's one of the reasons, presumably, why you would not advocate for the reinstatement of a VIP lane in the form it took during the pandemic.
Well, actually, I would not advocate for a VIP lane, but the existence of a VIP lane means that some of those who have access to significant networks and can source goods abroad can be dealt with in a way that would be different from a well-meaning individual who did not have that network.
It's not the only way to achieve it, though, is
It is not the only way to achieve it, no.
Let's
Can I put
move.
you a possibility, Mr. Gove? Supposing you had a system whereby when the team looked at an offer, you had red, amber, green. So red would be the sweet little lady who wanted to knit a mask. Green would be the possible James Dyson type, a manufacturer who could produce at speed and in quantity. And then in the middle you have possible can produce it, but not too sure. Would
Yeah,
that be the kind of prioritisation system that you would think could work?
Yes, my lady, and I think that in some of the evidence that the inquiry has heard, I can't remember which witness, it may have been Jonathan Maron, made the point that if, for example, Amazon offers to help, I mean, obviously there are all sorts of other questions about Amazon, you can be fairly certain that they will have the capacity to provide logistics support in the same way as a businessman who operates in the Far East and sources items of clothing and other garments is more likely, inevitably so, more likely to be able to provide PPE than a football agent.
Mr. Gove, let's move on through the email exchanges to INQ 000 533988. It's 10 days later, 14th of April 2020. Paul Bywater to Max Cairnduff. There we are. Second paragraph. David wants to David wants to speak to me today. I don't have a problem speaking to him whilst on leave, but I wanted to check on what line I should take on his existing gown officers. We know he has Michael Gove's ear. Now, pausing there for a moment, do you think that phrase that's used is a caution against offering any form of favouritism to David Mellor, or is the opposite, is suggesting that this person should receive preferential treatment on account of his relationship, the influence that he can have with Michael Gove, on a normal reading of those words?
No, I think it's something else. I think that Max here is acknowledging that these offers have been in triage for almost 2 weeks, and judging by, I don't know whose email, they had dropped through the cracks. So it would appear to be the case that, and this is no criticism of Max or any of the team, it would appear to be the case that there had been a system snafu. And Max entirely understandably said, or the person emailing Max says, I don't want to jump on a call when I know that gowns, aprons are a priority, and simply say that I can't tell him anything further. I will, if that is your advice, but we all know that private officers will be following that call up fairly quickly with some urgent chasing for clarity. So the key thing there, to my mind, is concern that a provider, in this case Mr. Mellor, but it could have been any provider, had not been treated with the efficiency that one would want at the apex of efficiency, as it were, and that if it was the case that it got back to me, I might say, bloody hell, irrespective of who the person making the offer was, why is it that anyone providing something that we need desperately is not being dealt with in this way? Had it been any other provider who had contacted me and who had said there is a flaw in the system, as a number did, then I would have pursued that energetically in order to ensure that the system worked.
All right, Mr. Gove, those are two competing interpretations of this email. I'm going to move on because I'm conscious of time. Could we have INQ 000 534834? It's an email from Lord Feldman to Andy Wood, in which Lord Bethel is CC'd. I've just spoken to David Mellor, and once again, a good friend of Michael Gove, who has asked us. So this is actually the email we looked at earlier.
Yeah.
The question here, let's just, can we scroll up to the top of it now? Because I don't think we, it says, are you able to handle this? Please confirm. It seems a terrific opportunity. And the response that Andy Wood gives is, up the top, thank you. We are on this one with Bruce and team. The price is very high, even in today's market. So we'll need extra handling. You weren't involved in discussions about price, were you? Did you know that the price being asked by Mr. Mellor was approximately twice the going rate at the time? Did you know that?
I did not know that.
There are two sources to establish that. Well, three. You can either take it from me, Mr. Gove. Mr. Mellor ended up entering into a contract through Mellor Designs worth £164 million. Were you aware of that?
Subsequently, yes.
Yeah. And were you aware that within that contract, the average price for medical gowns was £5.87? Sorry, the average price at the time was £5.87, but Mr. Mellor Designs medical gowns cost £12.64, so a little over twice the going rate. Were you aware of that?
No.
Yeah. Is it possible, I know you've given your interpretation of each of these emails, that there was pressure felt by those that didn't interpret those emails in the way that you have this afternoon to enter into a contract with Mr. Mellor, contrary to commercial advice or the going rate? Is that a possibility?
No.
Why would it not be a possibility?
Because I can't imagine for any reason Mr. Wood or anyone else choosing to place a contract on that basis. So those decisions over the issuance of contracts were matters for officials, not for politicians. And also, I would say that, again, in the work that's been done by the National Audit Office and also by Nigel Boardman, they make it clear that those decisions were taken autonomously.
Mr. Gove, finally, in your reflections section, you say the high priority lane was not the initiative of ministers, it was the idea of officials.
Yes.
You don't know where it originates, do you?
I don't know.
So you're not really able to state that with such clarity in your statement, are you?
Well, I don't know of any minister who, I asked repeatedly, I don't know of any minister who initiated it, no.
But I mean, it's never too late to correct an error. Are these two sentences baseless? We're going to look at this with other witnesses, Mr. Gove. The high priority lane was not the initiative of ministers. It was the idea of officials. You simply don't know whether that's correct or incorrect, do you?
To the best of my knowledge, I do, yeah.
What is the basis for you saying that it is officials that came up with the idea?
That's what I was told.
By whom?
By the officials with whom I was working in order to ensure that my evidence could be consistent with the high standards the inquiry requires.
I think you've answered this already, and the chair has supplemented this point with some additional questions. But at 102 of your reflections, you say that it would be absurd if in the teeth of a terrible crisis, government officials had failed to institute a process to manage and assess the potentially life-saving offers that we were receiving in vast numbers on a daily basis. You don't go so far as to say that the system that was used is the only way of achieving that important objective, do you?
It's not the only way, of course not.
Yeah. All right, Mr. Gove, thank you. Those were all my questions. I gather there are questions for you that will come to you from others.
There's some questions from Ms Mitchell. This time I've got it right. Who sits there?
Mr Gove, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. On Saturday, the 14th March 2020 to the 16th of March, the ventilator challenge began over the course of that weekend. And I'm about to take us to an email which you sent to Mark Sedwill at the Cabinet Office on the 2nd of April 2020, just over a fortnight later. This email has a very long list of questions about important issues in relation to the early days of COVID, and I wonder if that might be the email that you're referring to at an earlier stage. That's INQ 0000217031. Now, in that email, at the start of the email, you indicate that you're going to pose a series of questions, but state that you're not expecting immediate answers to that. Do we see that? Now, what I would like to take you to is a particular issue that you posed. If we can go, it's the 5th question from the bottom, and it comes within the context of the issue of ventilators that you've identified. And a question you posed, and it's certainly no daft laddie questions, is are we certain we've approached every possible domestic supplier, collaborator in the private sector? What can the Chemical Industries Association offer? What has been the structured set of conversations with the wider life sciences or biosciences sector? Now, presumably you're asking that question at that time because you didn't yet know the answers to it.
Yes.
Now, in relation to these are questions that are being posed a fortnight after the ventilator challenge was taken up. Ought these to be of the kind of questions that were answered or had the ability to be answered before calling for the ventilator challenge rather than after, given the unfortunate effect that the ventilator challenge had of causing the system to flood with offers?
I don't think the ventilator challenge did have an unfortunate effect in causing the system to flood with offers.
Well, the whole system was flooded with offers. Part of that was people contacting, and we've heard evidence about it, people contacting the government about offers in relation to ventilators. What I'm asking is, the questions that you're posing there, would they have been better asked before the ventilator challenge was announced, so that the government could have satisfied itself that they had already approached every domestic supplier, collaborator in the private sector, the chemical industries, and had a structured set of conversations with the wider life sciences or biosciences sector?
Can I refer you to the 4th paragraph?
Yes, certainly.
So here I'm talking about testing. So the point I'm making is that there are some things that we have learned from the ventilator challenge that may or may not have a relevance to testing.
Indeed. But the question that you're asking about, here about collaborations in the private sector with the Chemical Industries Association and the life sciences and biosciences sector, are you saying that those are in relation to PPE and not in relation to ventilators?
No, I'm saying they're in relation to testing.
Okay. And in relation to testing, why at that particular stage did you raise it as part of the issues under your questions in relation to ventilators and not later when you deal with the issue of testing in your letter?
It is about testing. I think you're misreading the letter. So I make the point that I'm going to raise testing first of all. I then reassure Mark Sedwill that I have confidence and respect for many others. And then I say, with respect to testing, what are we acquiring? What do we actually need? So I ask about kits. And then I use an analogy with the ventilator process to illuminate the debate about testing. So it's a point about testing, not about anything else.
So you're suggesting that those questions aren't about testing. Does that seem clear to you when you've read it that way?
Yes, because the Chemical Industries Association and the life sciences and biosciences sector are exactly the sort of people who might help with testing, not with PPE or with ventilators.
Moving on to my next question, in the same document you asked, this is on the next page at 02, it's the 6th paragraph down, and it's in relation to public sector testing. The paragraph starts, if, according to the latest DHSC papers. And the question I want to ask about is just further down in that paragraph, which says, we understand that CMO's office is working with counterparts and DAs. How can we make sure there's a consistent approach in prioritisation of public sector testing across the UK? Did you receive a response to that question?
I can't recall. My aim was, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, to ensure that wherever possible we didn't have different lists of key workers who should be tested ahead of others, quite understandably, in different parts of the United Kingdom. We couldn't ensure that that was the case, but coordination there, I think, would have been wise. I don't have to hand Mark Sedwell's reply.
And I think you've already touched on it, but why did you consider that that was a matter of importance? Why should it have been consistent across all 4 nations?
Wherever possible, consistency of approach across the entire United Kingdom would make things easier in terms of communication. So, for the sake of argument, if there are a particular group of people who are prioritised for testing in England but not in Scotland, that might give rise to concern and to a lack of clarity in communication. So, it would seem to me that particularly if you have more with Wales and England than with Scotland and England, cross-border activity as well, you'd want to ensure that if it were teachers who were prioritised ahead of nurses or vice versa, that the same approach was taken. So that would seem to be efficient and logical, but of course it's one of a number of things which one could not mandate.
Lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Mitchell. Mr Gove, that completes the questions. Politicians or former politicians are sometimes accused of mincing their words. You couldn't be accused of that today. Thank you very much for your help. I know that the burden I impose on people like you, asking you to come back, prepare written statements, coming on to give evidence. But as you'll understand, it's because of the wide range of responsibilities you had and my very wide terms of reference. So thank you for your help.
Not at all. Thank you, my lady.
I think there's a matter in relation to a document. Mr.
Yes,
Ward.
my lady. That there is an issue that has arisen in relation to one particular document. Could I just ask in relation to INQ 000533 868 that there be no reporting carried out until the position has been clarified and confirmed?
Thank you. There's a possibility I may have to restrict some of the content. Certainly, I so order. Very well. Thank you all very much indeed. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
All rise.